Hey everyone, today we're joined a star of professional wrestling. He's been involved in the industry for over 7 years, known for his time in various promotions, including Championship Wrestling, New Japan Strong, United Wrestling Network, and the National Wrestling Alliance. Jordan, sir, thank you so much for joining us today.
Ken, thanks for having me. I always appreciate you taking the time to speak to people like me and being able to give us a platform to get our message out. So thank you.
Absolutely. You're honestly somebody who I've been meaning to reach out to for quite a while. It was just, the time and everything like that. Because I'm a big fan of your work from the National Wrestling Alliance, from the NWA. And you have so much personality and you've grown so quickly. I think might have been with Joe Galley, it might have been with somebody else, but we talked about you on this channel and just how quickly you grew within like a 1 year period. It was just really impressive.
Yeah, to put myself over for a second, I couldn't agree
Please do.
more. The career experience and trajectory that I've um, lived through over the last 2 years is nothing like the 5 years that came before that. It was literally a 1 to 2 year sprint, which took 5 years to build. But to see that take off was very humbling for me.
That's awesome. And we'll get into as much as possible. With these first interviews, I like to dive a lot into the early career because I always find that so fascinating. But we're going to talk about some recent stuff too. Before we get into all the questions, where can people check you out?
So I am at Clear Like Water One across all social media platforms, Facebook, Twitter, I guess they call that X now, Instagram, as well as YouTube. You can find some matches I post on YouTube pretty irregularly, but if you're looking for full-length matches, I do post those there as well.
And of course, you are a star of the National Wrestling Alliance, who NWA has been very kind to us. We interview a lot of guests from the NWA. And guys, make sure to check them out and make sure to check Jordan out. Now, I believe there is another thing that you have going on that's a pretty big deal that I want to hear about.
Yeah, so outside of you mentioned the NWA, just upcoming things that I've got going on. First, the NWA has a pay-per-view in my home state of Ohio, not my hometown. My hometown is Harrison or Cincinnati, Ohio, but in Cleveland, not too far. That's October 28th. I'll be there for that. And then outside of professional wrestling, I will be entering my third professional bodybuilding competition under Team Elite. I'll be doing men's physique at the Steve Carr Classic in Las Vegas. That is Saturday, November 11th. So if you're in the area for either one of those, please come hit me up.
How cool is that? Within 2 weeks, you have a big NWA pay-per-view, and then you have a big bodybuilding event. That must be a crazy time for you. You must be really nervous but excited, I think.
Oh my gosh, nervous, excited, tired, exhausted, the whole gambit. I love bodybuilding, but I love professional wrestling even more. So I'm gonna do my best on the 28th, and then we'll let bygones be bygones on the 11th. But just going through the prep that's required for the bodybuilding competition, it does make wrestling quite difficult, just because of the energy level, low calorie deficit, and all of those things.
That's interesting because from an outsider's perspective in my head, I'm thinking of more of the positives first, where I'm like, okay, so you're going to be in phenomenal shape, which only helps you in
Yeah,
wrestling because it's such a cosmetic business. I don't even think about the other
right.
aspect of you're going to be exhausted, just probably moody, tired, just dead to the world.
Hey man, you got it. Like, on the outside looking in, I'll probably look the best I've ever been, the leanest I've ever been, the most cut up and just shredded on camera. But in the ring, inside, I'm gonna be exhausted. I'm gonna be tired. I'm gonna be hungry. It's been tough to focus even the last couple weeks. So, as much as I love it, I'll be so glad to have this over with.
Fantastic. So yeah, guys, please check them out, show some support, check the NWA out. We will have links in the description of this full video, and for each individual clip, we will have links in the description. With our guests, we always appreciate them coming on, sharing their time to tell their stories. So make sure to show some support back to them, please. Thank you so much. All right, so let's just go right to the beginning then. I want to start from before you even step foot in the ring. When did you first see pro wrestling? What were your initial thoughts on it? When did you become a fan?
Ooh, take me back to I think it was WrestleMania 24. It just happened. Towards the tail end of WrestleMania 24, I was I was still in school, just messing around, not really knowing what I wanted to do in life. But my brother was flipping through the channels and he said, "Hey, this might be something you'd be interested in." And he flips on Monday Night Raw. And I'll never forget, I saw Triple H, a babyface Triple H, wrestling what I would like to think is Kofi Kingston. I'm pretty sure it was Kofi Kingston. I couldn't find the match for you if I had to, but what I vividly remember is this tan, jacked dude coming out to Motorhead. Everybody loves this guy, and I was in awe. I was starstruck when I saw Triple H, and I just thought, that's what I'm destined to do. There was no question in my mind when I watched the first 30 seconds of that show that I was going to be a professional wrestler. And I have no idea why I got to that conclusion. I just know that it was it was born in me. It's in my blood. It just awakened a gene that I didn't know that I had. And so from that moment on, I was a diehard professional wrestling fan.
That's so cool. And it's interesting that you brought up Triple H being one of your favorites, because he's a name that's actually come up a few times. Mims, who you're all too familiar with, he was a huge Triple H guy, when he broke into it. Who would have thought, I guess maybe back then, because I'm a little older than you. I'm 31. 32. Wow, I'm getting really old. I forgot my old age for a second. I just had my birthday a couple weeks ago. But so for me, when I first started seeing Triple H, it was like at the tail end of, Hunter Hearst Helmsley. And then I got to see his rise to being a top guy. When you got in, he was the top guy. He was already having power behind the scenes. But who would have thought he would be so influential to where he is today? It's incredible.
It is incredible. I think Triple H has had a profound impact on the sports entertainment business, not just for professional wrestlers, because on that side of the fence, everyone can appreciate how good Triple H is. I would argue that Triple H is one of the best, if not the best, all-around wrestler there's ever been. He throws the best punch. He's good at grappling. He's good at telling a story. He's good at selling. He's good at he's good at everything you could possibly be good at. And he's a jack of all trades to the WWE. And so that's on a professional wrestling side of things. But as a fan, he still translates a lot of the things that we look for in superstars, things that we want to relate to. Again, tan, jacked, everyone's cheering him. Who wouldn't want to be that person? Or when you were watching Hunter Hearst Helmsley, long hair, right? Or even when he had the bun when he was a French diplomat, all of those things, just screams personality. And so I think he's got it on both sides of the fence.
And then who would have thought, because people would have their preconceived notions. I grew up part of, the internet in the early 2000s, maybe more mid 2000s for me. And, Triple H was this bad guy because he was always champion, blah, blah, blah. And who would have thought that, he would make NXT, the coolest thing for those hardcore fans, where you have, all the biggest indie guys and the guys who don't necessarily look like Triple H. The fact that he is so smart to say, this is what works for me, but maybe this doesn't work for someone else, and he can make them work too in their own way. It's special. It's cool.
It's special. It just speaks to the volume, and it speaks to the talent that Triple H has. It speaks to how professional he is in the business side and in the wrestling side. He puts the professional and professional wrestler, because everything that he does in that ring, on that microphone, is technically sound, but his mind for the business is so much larger than that he's able to literally build NXT from the ashes and create it into something that's traveling the nation, selling out arenas on pay-per-views. His track record is there top to bottom. It's quite a unique thing, and it's very special to have in professional wrestling. And I know there's criticism levied against Triple H for supposed burials in the past, but I just think that what we see today is really definitive of the person that he is, and that person is one that wants to give back to the professional wrestling community, not one that wants to take.
Really good insight. And we talked about Triple H being one of your favorites, but I'm curious, who else did you gravitate towards as a fan and over time? Who were some of your favorites?
Yeah, so Triple H is definitely my all-time favorite. I would say right below Triple H, I started to find a very strong liking and respect for Chris Jericho. Chris Jericho was a large factor in me also wanting to join professional wrestling. There's somebody that didn't look like the average guy, that was funnier than the average guy, and could still perform amazing feats of acrobatics in the ring. But I'd have to put Chris Jericho at number 3 because one summer changed my mind, and that was the summer of Punk. CM Punk had always been an underdog, dark horse favorite for me growing up into professional wrestling, but during the summer of Punk, during the Money in the Bank match with John Cena, I think that was one of the first times since I watched professional wrestling for the first time that I had that same feeling of this is legit and something is going to happen. And for whatever reason, my teenage self just, it just gravitated towards CM Punk. Regardless of what you see in the news today, I would probably put H at 1, Punk at 2, and Jericho at 3. But there's so many more people that I emulate or draw inspiration off of. I was such a big fan of Damian Sandow, Aaron Stevens now in the NWA, the Masterpiece, Chris Masters, now Chris Adonis, Tyrus. I was a big fan of the Funkasaurus, believe it or not. I mean, that was my timeline in watching wrestling. And to even take it back farther than that, Ken, I'm a big fan of the Von Erichs. Kerry Von Erich was one of the people that I built one of my robes around. Ric Flair, same with him. I modeled the robe after Ric Flair. Barry Windham, watching Barry move and his striking and his just sheer power and intensity in the ring. All of those guys, Rick Rude
Yeah, I was gonna say
specifically
Rick
too.
Rude. I see in you.
Yeah, Rick Rude, very much so. And what's funny about Rick Rude is, growing up, I was really the only person watching professional wrestling in my household outside of, well, my grandpa and my dad would watch with me from time to time. But my uncle turned out to be a very big fan of wrestling, and I always remember asking him what his favorite and who his least favorite was, and he always liked the Hands of Steel Ronnie Garvin, and he always hated Rick Rude. And I always hated Rick Rude because he hated Rick Rude. And then I grew up and became a professional wrestler and became Rick Rude.
That's fantastic. I'm glad you brought up though. It's a great chance for me to transition. You're such a pro. You talked about how he hated Rick Rude. You hated Rick Rude. Who were some of the wrestlers that you hated most? And it's interesting because I'm not sure exactly of your age when you broke in, but it was a different era where there wasn't as much kayfabe. But of course, when you're young, you still might have people that you love, you detest. And the thing is it can be looked at in one of two ways. You can either look at it as, I didn't think this person was very good, so I wasn't a fan, or the bigger one, which is typically the case, which is kind of a compliment. They're so good at their job that you just couldn't stand them.
Yeah, that's it's a good question. I would say that well, first off, I started watching at 24. What WrestleMania are we on now? 33,
39,
34?
40 is coming up. So yeah.
Sorry, 40. Wow. I watched 39. Don't hold that against me. I'm 40. Wow. Funny story. I was actually able to go to 5 different WrestleManias while I was a child, 26 through 30 itself. So I don't know why I would think they're on 33. Yeah,
Time flies. Time flies.
Time does fly. That's the real excuse. So I started watching at 24. I've been watching for, I guess almost 15, 16 years. So I started watching maybe when I was 8 to 10 is when I was getting into professional wrestling. But to answer your question, Ken, I would say the person that I despised, and not because they're not any good, but just because my kid brain couldn't differentiate fantasy from reality, was Randy Orton.
Oh yeah.
And I could not stand Randy Orton growing up. I truly thought that man was the worst person on the face of this earth. And now that I'm in the business, I understand so much more about how great of a talent he is to make me believe that. but also just all around, what a great professional wrestler. Anyway, growing up, I was not a fan of Randy Orton, Cody Rhodes, the young Ted DiBiase. I
Legacy.
didn't
Yep.
like any of those guys. As a matter of fact, I wasn't a heel fan at all. It wasn't until CM Punk, Sandow, that I started to like heels, just like I like baby faces, if that makes sense.
It totally makes sense. I think we all go through that kind of transition. Interesting enough, for me, the exception was the Undertaker. He was my favorite. So whether he was a heel or a babyface, I loved him no matter what. But
Right.
but then I started becoming, once I got into my teen years, I started being like, oh, Carlito, he's here and he's a heel, but he's so over the top and I love it. Heel
Yep.
Randy Orton, not that era, but from like the young, like 2003, 2004, before he turned babyface heel Orton. I loved him. And then like
Sure.
Mr. Kennedy, like for me, like the cocky young babyface, just when I was a preteen and a teen, it hit.
Yeah, it's talking about Mr. Kennedy really quickly. That's a talent that we never got to see reach its full potential. I remember, what was it, 23? He had that big grand stage, and he had that entrance with the mic. I thought that was so cool. I had a bunch of these microaggression action figures I used to play with, the very tiny ones, and I'd build these sets and I'd book my own storylines and my own cards. And funny enough, Zack Ryder was winning every single main event. Don't ask me why, just was at the time. And I believe when I started watching, Zack Ryder was a heel as an edgehead with Kurt Hawkins. And for whatever reason, I just gravitated towards that personality. Like you said, like you go through these stages, but Damian Sandow was another one like CM Punk that really changed my mind. When I saw Aaron, and I'm not just saying this because I consider Aaron a close mentor and a close friend of mine. But truly, when I watched Aaron for the first time, I thought he was so different. Pink tights, robe, using these huge words and talking as this philosopher. And it just, everything about that personality honestly screamed me a little bit. And I thought, man, this guy's something else. I like this guy.
So much charisma, so much personality. And I just want to, with these, I tend to ask side questions. I bounce around the timeline. We never stick strictly to the notes, which is why I can never, finish somebody's career in one interview. This just doesn't work for the way I do it. But how cool is it? You mentioned, Sandow, you mentioned Ryder, Matt Cardona, Aaron Stevens, Tyrus. These are guys that you grew up watching, and then you got to work either directly with them or share a locker room with them. How special is that for you?
I can't put it into words. It's surreal. They say you never meet your heroes because they tend to turn out to be different people. But I'll tell you that those guys you just mentioned are more down to earth than others that I've met in the professional world, others that have never made it to the stages that they've made it to. I just, across the board, I haven't met people that are as giving as Tyrus, Aaron, and Chris are. Chris and I have a chemistry. Chris and I have had a chance to wrestle a few times, and for whatever reason, we just click in the ring, and he's so easy to work with, and we're right in the same mindset of how we like to do the business. I'll jump to Tyrus really quickly because Tyrus is one of the people I didn't expect to become such a big influencer in my life, but ended up becoming a cornerstone of my career. Tyrus really took the time to invest in me at the NWA. Tyrus saw talent in me when nobody else would or could. And Tyrus put me on a pedestal and gave me a platform to succeed. And the thing about Tyrus is he still does give me a platform to succeed. Even last week, I was sitting front row seat at one of Tyrus's comedy shows, and he still put me out there for the world to know who I am. And that just speaks to the type of person Tyrus is. He's invited me into his own home. I've stayed with his family, and I've had a chance to be with him, with my wife in New Orleans. And Tyrus is the type of person that would give you the shirt off his back if you were freezing. And to talk to Aaron really quickly, Aaron is the reason that I have made it from the Indies to New Japan Strong to the National Wrestling Alliance. Again, Aaron is one of those people that saw value in me when I felt like all hope was lost. Aaron came over and took over the book for Championship Wrestling from Hollywood for a short period. And Aaron pulled me inside and said, I've watched the program. I've watched you. You are a very consistent performer. And my goal here is to take you to the next level. And he did that. And Aaron did that and saw it through to the very bitter end. And I remember the very last day that Aaron was at the United Wrestling Network. It was the same day that I won the United Wrestling Network World Heavyweight Championship from Chris Dickinson. After that match, Aaron handed me a card. And on that card, it said, "Congratulations, you graduated." And it was so funny because it was like a high school graduation card, and Aaron had a few notes in there, and I'll keep that between Aaron and I. But what I'll share with you, Ken, is that it was one of the most meaningful things that anyone's ever given me across the board. And that's because it was very significant that I had graduated. I had graduated that level, right? And now it's time to move on to college. Now it's time to move on to post-secondary education, right? It's time to expand and go to the NWA and to New Japan and even beyond there, what the future has in store for the Golden Boys. So that's something that I keep framed because that was a gift that Aaron gave me that I'll hold on to the rest of my life.
That's super cool, super cool. And we'll definitely dive into more about all those individuals, that big title win in the future. But I really appreciate you sharing that. And, I think sometimes that's part of the appeal to doing a show like this is I think a lot of times people can get lost in their goals, right? You're always looking ahead to what's next. It's hard to look back and, really reflect on what you've done and the life you've led. Because if you think about it, for a lot of people, the second you step into that ring, you're living your childhood dream. And sometimes it can be hard to remember that when you're too busy thinking, I have this, I have this, I have a bodybuilding competition in a couple of weeks, I have the NWA pay-per-view, I have hopefully this opportunity, that opportunity. You can be so focused that sometimes it's hard for people to look back. I mean, we've had Brian Kendrick on the channel a couple of times, and he's somebody who almost never likes to look back. And I flat out told him, I was like, well, when you're here, I'm going to make you look back because you've done so much, and I want you to be able to appreciate what you've done because you deserve it. Like when you've lived a life like that, I want people to be able to appreciate what they've done. They don't have to, dwell on it, focus on it. But it's true, an hour while chatting with me, I want them to be able to see what they've done because I think they've changed a lot of lives, yourself included, and living a dream is pretty special.
I couldn't agree more. I've lived such a fantastic life, not to put myself over anymore, but I couldn't have asked for more out of this life. And if God forbid something happened to me today, I would be a happy man because you're right, Ken. I did get to live my childhood dream, and I still do get to live my childhood dream in the ring, out of the ring, on the bodybuilding stage, out of the bodybuilding stage, at home, at work, the things that I do in between wrestling and working out and bodybuilding. I've got a wonderful wife, and I've got what I would consider a wonderful family and friends, and I'm such a goal-oriented person that it is hard to look back. I just think the other day, my wife and I just purchased a second house the other day, and we looked back and thought, so much life has been lived, so many accomplishments have been had, and yet we haven't taken the time to sit down and soak all of those in. And that is a shame because you change so much every 5 years, and you do need to look at where you've been to see where you're going, and I think that's just as important as setting blind goals for the future is calibrating what you've done in the past, how you can make that better, and how do you make that a repeatable process in the future. And so I'm not sure if that was a question or just giving you additional context on how I feel there, but I couldn't agree more. Being retrospective is just as important as being perspective on your outcomes and goals.
And what's great is, you're still so young, that's, a fun thing is I'll talk to somebody like Tim Storm who, legendary guy, but he'll admit he's on the tail end of his career. And then I'll talk to somebody like yourself or Mims, who, in theory, you guys could be wrestling, and I don't want to put any words in your mouth, but 10 years, 20 years, who knows how much longer you guys have. So really, like, you haven't even hit your prime yet. And that's the beauty of it, because you have such a bright future ahead of you. But speaking of that, I do want to go back into the beginning of your career, specifically. How did you break into wrestling? How did you discover a school? What was the process like that? Because again, that changes. Like Tim Storm, he came up in the 90s. That's going to be drastically different breaking in then compared to breaking in when you did.
Yeah, so I definitely had a different experience than Tim had breaking into the business. I always knew that I wanted to be a professional wrestler, and by the time I turned 16, I started to apply to professional wrestling schools in the area, and I got told, hey, you've got to be 18 to sign up. We don't do the parental waiver here. Some schools do, but unfortunately in Ohio, I didn't get that chance. So waited patiently until I turned 18. When I turned 18 and I graduated high school, my friends and I went on a trip to Florida, a senior trip. And we were all sitting at a Miami Marlins game, and all I was doing is sitting there thinking, I should be selling out this arena as a wrestler. And the very next day I got back, I started to look at wrestling schools again. And so I checked out OVW, I checked out WWA4, a number of different promotions. But the one that I settled on is right in my hometown. It had the best track record, the best setup, the best fee structure. I just think it was the best all-around school in that tri-state area, and that was Bone Crushers, the Northern Wrestling Federation. And the head trainer there, Roger Ruffin, became a father figure to me, and still is a father figure to me to this day. I owe my career to Roger and the way that he trained me, and the way that he trained others. And it's important today because there is a lost art in professional wrestling, and that is learning how to work. Mm-hmm. And the workers know what I mean when I say know how to work. And Roger taught me that. He taught me, more importantly than just how to work in the ring, but how to work outside of the ring, how to be a professional, how to hold yourself to that professional standard, and how to be respectful and loyal and trustworthy and a person of integrity and character. And at the end of the day, Roger told me, if you have those things, you will be undeniable in the professional wrestling business. And Roger was right. So I started with the Northern Wrestling Federation, and that was back in 2015.
That is so cool to hear, and it's refreshing because, different schools train different things. And I've heard a complaint often that one of the things that people don't necessarily learn enough about is, the business side of the business, either how to conduct yourself, how to handle. For example, David Marquez from Championship Wrestling, of course, you know him all too well. We've had him on the channel before, and he said one of the biggest struggles he's had in wrestling is that people don't know how to conduct business, in the sense of, this is the money I want. Can you give it to me? Like, to have that discussion, people aren't necessarily equipped to do that. And obviously business and behavior aren't necessarily the same, but they're integrally linked a lot of times.
Right. And you have to hold yourself out as a professional, because in this environment you're not just a talent, but you're a small business owner, and you have to look at yourself in that fashion, right? There's so many things that come with that, as far as generating revenue for your business, from booking fees to selling merchandise, as well as being able to write off losses on your tax returns for gear, gas, food, hotel. Those are some of the business aspects. But outside of those, just operating yourself as a small business, just learning how to communicate with people in a professional manner, being able to present yourself as a consummate professional, not just in professional wrestling, but just in life. Other organizations like WWE, like AEW, I would imagine, are looking to invest in talent for the long term, and not talent that are going to burn out in 2 days and not show up to work on the third, but talent that understand that this is a business, and that there needs to be business-minded people in the business in order to keep it running, right? And so I couldn't agree more with Dave on that part. And Roger really did a great job of building that into me, along with the wrestling and the promo skills. And I owe that to him. I would have never thought that way if Roger hadn't introduced that topic to me early on.
Now, we have a lot of, you know, young people in the business who watch the channel, or people who are hoping to break into the industry in the future. Could you pass along some knowledge? If you're a young guy going into a locker room, maybe for the first time, or if you're new, could you give some tips, some advice on what kind of behavior people should follow? What's the best way to advance their career? Because, there's obviously the balance of, you need to be respectful, you need to be quiet, eyes open, ears open, mouth shut. But at the same time, you also need to be there. You need to be present. You need to be involved to learn. You need to ask questions. So what's the line? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I can keep it pretty simple on that one. Sit down, shut up, and listen. Those are the key indicators to success in this business. You don't know anything until you know something. And I promise you, still to this day, I don't know anything. You can always learn something in this industry. And the second that you open your mouth and start talking is the second that you close your ears and stop learning. And I would say that's the downfall of any professional wrestler. If you're a young person getting into the industry, you owe it to yourself and to the promotion that you're working at to give 100%. Paying your dues is a lost art in this business, and I think that term changes meaning as you get older, more seasoned, more veteran, but the principle still stays the same. When you're breaking in, you should be the first one to show up, the last one to leave. You go to Roger or you go to your promoter and say, hey, what is it that I need to do to get better, to get on the show, to make your life easier? You need me to run water, you need me to run the door, you need me to run the camera, you need me to cut production. Whatever it is that you do it, and do it to the best of your ability, because you're only going to make yourself be a more well-rounded professional wrestler. I go back to what I learned from CM Punk. When I was breaking into the industry, I did the same thing. I Googled on WikiHow. I said 10 steps to be a professional wrestler, no joke. And I actually went to a Comic-Con in Chicago and paid to ask CM Punk this very question, as much as of a fan I was at the time. And his response was the exact same. You need to dedicate yourself to the business. What made CM Punk so valuable to the WWE is that he could do commentary, he could wrestle, he could interview, he could cut television, he could write television. And by doing all of these things and learning all of these things, you make yourself an asset to the organization outside of being a professional wrestler. Now, a lot of youngins are going to look at me and say, whoa, I got in here to be a professional wrestler. And I understand that. So did I. But you also got in it because you love the sport of professional wrestling. You love the sports entertainment aspect. And a lot of times we all take different avenues to reach success. And for some people, that might be on the production side while still wrestling. Or for others, that just might be on wrestling. Or for a select few, they might just be cameramen or interviewers. But getting to know all aspects of the business is going to make you a commodity. And if you're there, and if you're a commodity, and if you're being used, you are most likely going to also be used as a professional wrestler and or be pushed as a professional wrestler. We were talking about kind of how I came into the industry. I think about my time back at the NWF. I would do everything that I could to make Roger's life easier. I drove the ring truck for Dave Marquez. I'd set up and tore down the ring every show for NWF for over 4 years. I scrubbed the toilets at the NWF. I cleaned the locker room. I scrubbed the mat, and I did all of those. Thankfully that Roger would let me do those things, because I've done nothing but dream about being in the sport. And whether I was just setting up the ring, sitting on security, or actually performing inside of those ropes, I was a happy person. And so I would challenge everybody to do the same thing. Prove yourself. The business owes you nothing. You owe it everything. Times have changed and the territory system has changed, but paying your dues has not. And I would really urge everyone to consider that path when getting into professional wrestling.
Very cool. Thank you for that insight. I very much appreciate it. One thing I did want to touch on, you talked about Roger and training with him, and there was something in my notes that I wasn't sure about, so I'd like for you to clarify or explain. I saw one of your trainers was Karl Anderson, and I'm not really sure if that's accurate, if it was something that happened later on. Could you explain what that's all about, if you know?
Yeah, so at the NWF, Rogers trained a lot of successful professional wrestlers. Jillian Hall, Abyss, Karl Anderson, Wildcat Chris Harris, and all of those guys, with the exception of Jillian Hall, have had a hand in helping to train me at some point in time over my career at the NWF. And all have had different levels of impact. Abyss was the person that really spoke to me about the world outside of the Northern Wrestling Federation and what it meant to kind of get to that next level. Abyss's psychology in the ring and out of the ring really helped transform me into being just a normal indie guy to being a television wrestler. Wildcat Chris Harris is in the same boat. His mind is second to none. And I'd put him up there with Abyss as one of those people that was a guiding light for me at the Northern Wrestling Federation. And Karl Anderson, I mentioned him specifically because without Chad's influence, I would most likely still be in Cincinnati, Ohio.
Wow.
And Chad and I have met a few times, and Chad's been grateful enough to take me out when he comes to town. But the thing with Chad is he called me one day and he said, "Hey, I know that things are going well for you at the NWF. I know that you're looking to be the world heavyweight champion here soon. But let me just challenge you and say this. Vince McMahon is not walking through the doors of Bone Crushers in Cincinnati, Ohio, unfortunately. You have to be able to expand and grow outside of the Northern Wrestling Federation." And so Chad said, "I don't know if it's California, if it's New York, if it's Florida. I don't know where you need to go. I can introduce you to some people in California, but you just need to go somewhere. You have the talent. You just need to get out there." And I never forget that call from Karl Anderson. I put that phone down. I walked into work the next day, put a 2-week notice on my desk, and packed up my car and moved out to California with no game plan in sight. I took that advice, and it was the best thing that ever happened to me personally and professionally, and I owe that to Chad.
Wow, that's super cool. Even better than I expected. Great to hear, the influence from Karl Anderson, from Abyss, from Chris Harris, and just very
Yeah.
cool. Very cool. I want to talk about your training a little bit because the way people train can be vastly different. I talked to Jack Selstrom, who was Jack Stars on NXT UK, and he talked about how for maybe 6 months or something, he didn't even get in a ring. He was just on mats. And obviously, that's not the general routine these days, but that still happens sometimes. What was training like for you? What was an average day like? How big was the class? Was it just you and a couple others? Were they different experience levels? Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so training was, I would say training pretty much followed the same structure early on. There was probably 20 of us coming to training regularly. 2 or 3 of those guys were in my class, I would say specifically, just starting out in the business. Then you had some intermediate wrestlers, some wrestlers that were already on the show, some experienced wrestlers just looking to get ring time in. And really, the class followed the same structure of, some calisthenic workouts at the beginning to get your cardio up. We would do rolls in the ring, hit the ropes. The new guys would pop out and do chain wrestling on the floor, on the mats, much like the gentleman that you mentioned. And then towards the end, we would get in the ring and take bumps, learn how to take bumps. Surprisingly, that was the thing I was looking forward to the most. But I think the thing that I was the worst at early on was taking bumps. But we would take some bumps, and if we were lucky, if you were real lucky, you'd get to run a spot or maybe even a training match. And so I did that for Roger for maybe 3 or 4 years, and not until I debuted, but just ongoing training. I never stopped training. And then as I became more experienced, I started leading classes and becoming the trainer. And then when I moved out to Southern California, that whole environment changed. I got an idea for what other facilities look like and how they run their classes and what their trainers do. And again, I owe that to Chad because I would have never had that experience. I never left NWF, and it taught me a lot. You know what I mean? It definitely taught me a lot training out here in Southern California.
I just got two questions in my mind. One's kind of a quicker one. You talked about having some difficulty bumping early on. Was it the flip bump or just the standard bump or both?
Flat back, baby. It was the worst. I couldn't stop catching myself. I was gonna break my arms, and then Roger's like, literally, somebody's gonna sit on all fours, and you're just gonna fall like a child on your back until you can figure this out, or you're gonna die, whichever comes first. And so I guess I figured it out because I'm not dead yet. Knock on wood.
Thank goodness. Now, again, you brought up something interesting where, you transitioned from being the trainee, and over time you started to train yourself. And this is another thing that came up with Jack Selstrom. And, he kind of went through the same experience. He trains a lot of people in England now. And I have the same question for you that I came up with that I had for him. Do you find that once you started training people, it was making you a better pro because you had an eye paying attention to what mistakes they would make, and in return, it would make you think about what mistakes you could make or shouldn't make in the future?
I couldn't agree more. You learn so much more as a trainer than you do as a trainee because you're still just trying to grasp the basic concepts of the business. As a trainer, you're reminding yourself of those basics and probably have forgotten a few of those along the way and maybe even picked up some bad habits as well. So you get to work those bad habits out when you're training other people. And then the last thing that I'll say is you get to envision a world in which people are wrestling in front of you and maybe think of different ways to do a reversal or a move. And so your brain's constantly thinking just in a different capacity as a trainer versus a trainee. So I love training individuals. I've had the opportunity to do it in private sessions in California and public sessions in California as well. I've never done a seminar yet, but that's something that I'd be open to just because I feel like there's so much to learn and so much to know in the business. And most importantly is that you'll find that certain things in professional wrestling I feel are objectives, truths that you have to do. But there's a lot of the sport that's also subjective, and there isn't one certain way to do everything. And so by learning from different people, by talking to different people, you get to learn, see, and feel different ways to express yourself that might be better than how you were taught originally.
You talked about potentially doing a seminar in the future. Have you ever been a part of seminars? Not that, have you attended is the word I should use. Any interesting seminars in the past?
Oh yeah, I've attended a lot of interesting seminars, and I'll put over Abyss here too because his seminar was the best seminar that I attended from a psychological standpoint. Again, because there's so many things we talk about in wrestling, and a lot of people like to focus on the spots and the moves and the the 5-star matches, but there's so much more that goes into that, especially on television. And Abyss was the one that opened my mind that you start wrestling the moment you walk through the curtain, and you don't stop until you walk back through that curtain. And that principle was totally new to me, even though it makes common sense. It just at the time, your brain doesn't think like that. And so those are some of the principles that Abyss taught me that I carry with me to this day. But his seminar was definitely one of the best.
Definitely. That's very cool. And again, look at where he's at today, his role behind the scenes and what he's done. So that speaks volumes. I want to go back to your first ever match, or at least what I found was your first match. You might have to correct me if it's mistaken. That's the fun part about the internet. They lie a lot. The earliest match I could find for you was against Anthony Bryant on July 9th, 2016 from NWF Tri-State. And it was a Tri-State title match, in Ohio. Is that accurate or was that wrong?
That is wrong.
Oh, see, correction.
That is wrong. I had my first match when I was 18. It was on February, I believe it was Valentine's Day. It was on February 14th, 2016. And I wrestled Roger for DCW, Big Jim Hutchinson up in this is going to test my knowledge of Ohio. Let's see if I remember it. I want to say like Troy, Ohio, near Dayton, kind of, but that could be wrong. I still have photos on my phone. There's a funny story there if we got time to get into it.
Please.
But so that day we were supposed to have a show at the NWF, but the pipes froze at the building, so Roger canceled the show. I'm at the gym working out, and Roger texts me. He's like, how fast can you be at my house? And I'm like, I guess 30 minutes if I leave right now. And Roger's like, okay. And I start to think, I'm like, why would he ask that? There's no show today. Maybe we're going to go down and do work at Bone Crushers, clean up a little bit, pay some dues like I was talking about earlier. I get to Roger's house, and he hands me boots that are 2 sizes too big and a singlet that's 2 sizes too big. And he says, try these on. And I try them on and it starts to settle in. I'm like, am I going to wrestle? Is this going to be my first match? No word. Roger drives me and his wife, Tasha, to Troy, Ohio, or wherever this show was for Big Jim Hutchinson. Doesn't say a word to me until we get there. We get there and he says, you're wrestling tonight. Your name is going to be Brady Clearwater, and you're going to put this on, and we're going to have a 10-minute match. And that was the most nerve-wracking moment of my life. We had to duct tape the boots to my ankles because they didn't fit and they were all broken. And the leotard was 2 sizes too big, or not leotard, the singlet or whatever was 2 sizes too big. But I sure did wrestle, and they mispronounced my name as Jordan Clearwater instead of Brady Clearwater, which is why I am now Jordan Clearwater instead of Brady. You could thank that to the announcer all of those years ago today, 7 years ago. And I came out to some random Slipknot song, and I'll never forget that.
Fantastic. So you were very nervous. I mean, because it's interesting. Sometimes you hear people who are overconfident, like, I'm ready. And then like, oh, I wasn't ready. Or they're like, I'm not ready. But then it turns out okay. Or, it was kind of a disaster. How do you think it went? Because it's with your trainer. So that kind of makes it a little easier, even though it's nerve-wracking for a different reason. Because when it's with your trainer, you're like, if you fail, you're failing somebody who's so close to you and that you want to impress. So it's a different kind of nervous, but
it sure is. It really is. And I still get more nervous if I go home and I visit family. I'll always bring my gear to see if Roger has a place for me to wrestle at home. And he usually does. He always does. And honestly, that can be some of the most nerve-wracking matches because, I'm back at home and I want to impress and show out to the people that were there, and especially my trainer. In that moment, that's probably one of the most nervous. I was more nervous for that match than I was proposing to my wife. Let's put it that way. And, I was more nervous for that match than probably on my wedding day. Let's put it that way too.
Fantastic.
Yeah, don't show this to my wife. Anyway, joking aside, I was so nervous, and I do mean that. I was so nervous, and I'm sure it was terrible. I don't remember the match being terrible. I wouldn't show it to my family and friends today. Let's put it that way. But it was such a great experience, and I wouldn't have done it with anybody else. And so after that match, to kind of build on that, Roger had me wrestling for DCW and PTW, which no longer exists, in Georgetown, Kentucky, for a legendary Larry D. And so I got to wrestle for those guys for about 6 months before I ever debuted at the NWF, just so I could get my ring feet on. I could kind of learn a little bit before having some on-the-job training at the NWF and jumping right into a title match. So I did have a pretty good string of matches before I debuted in 2016.
Very cool. Now, what were your goals when you first broke in? Because this is another interesting subject. Some people, their dream is just, hey, I want to have a match. Some people's like, hey, I want to be at WrestleMania. There's a big middle area too. What was it for you? What were your immediate goals and what were your long-term goals at that time?
I think I only saw things through the lens of, I'm going to make this into my career. I'm going to be a professional wrestler in whatever regards that meant. Obviously, I think at the end of the day, a lot of us, or should I say all of us, want to wrestle for the WWE, right? I mean, that's the big behemoth in the business, is WWE. But breaking in, I kind of just saw things day by day, learning the ropes, focusing on improving and really rising the ranks at the NWF first, is kind of how I saw myself, progressing through my career. I figured that if I was good enough, I should be able to move through the ranks at the NWF and the titles at the NWF to be champion one day. But that was never my goal. My goal was definitely to have been able to make money doing this professionally, to be with a large promotion on a large television show, surrounded by people that are better than I am. And so I dare to say that I've achieved that goal being at the NWA, but that was my initial goal, kind of getting into professional wrestling.
You talked about how you came up through Ohio. What was the Ohio wrestling scene like at that point? How aware were you of the other promotions and the Midwest in general? Because obviously there's some, AIW, further up north, I believe, is AAW. You know, you have all these, you know, some trendy indies and then a plethora of other independent companies. So what was your mindset at the time? How familiar were you with the area?
Yeah, I out of respect, I would say out of respect for Roger, I stayed close to home at the NWF for the first several years while I was learning to perfect my craft. So I didn't travel much in those first couple years, and I think that was the right decision. You don't want to spread your wings too soon and start to leave foul tastes in people's mouths. You want to make sure that you're polished, you're pristine, and you're professional when you go out there. So I don't regret that one bit. But after about the 2 year mark, I started to expand my horizons. The professional wrestling scene in Ohio wasn't the best at the time. Ohio Valley Wrestling was still operating, but it wasn't at its capacity that it's at now. This was before Al Snow owned or purchased OVW. There was a promotion that I wrestled for in Georgetown, which was PTW, and we did shows in Paris and Georgetown and a few other local places. That kept me pretty busy. The NWF ran a weekly show, which kept me busy. There was also the promotion for Big Jim Hutchinson in north near Dayton. I did those shows a few times. That was DCW. I think that's Dynamic Championship Wrestling. Right above Dayton, you have a pretty well-known school. It was called Rockstar. I don't know if it still exists at the time, but you had the Jake Christ came out of there, I believe. Ace Austin, Trey Miguel. You had all of those people kind of training in that Dayton area. Myron Reed and those types of people. Sammy Callahan.
Really
And
good
then
people from Ohio, man.
yeah. I never really made that connection to Rockstar. Nothing against Rockstar or any of those guys. I just had never crossed paths with them until, I got to wrestle Myron in Kentucky, and I saw Myron for the first time in years just last year, and he's doing so well. And all of those guys seem to be doing so well at WWE and Impact, and super happy for all of those guys. Beyond Ohio, I never wrestled for AIW or AAW up north, but I did start to venture into Michigan, where I was wrestling for BWCW in Port Huron. I loved those shows. They drew extremely well. We ran a huge soccer stadium one year. My whole family came. We chilled by the lake, went across the Canadian border for some lunch. It was such a great time. Can't say enough good things about that promotion because Andrew, the promoter of BWCW, did something at the time that is so interesting to reflect back on. He ran a Rising Stars tournament of BWCW, and some of the names in that tournament make me laugh because it was myself, it was Jungle Boy was in that category, Brian Pillman was in that category as well, and I don't think I got to wrestle either one of those people through the tournament, but I got to know them at BWCW, and we were all so young in the business. So funny to look back on that now, 7 years later, to see what all of us did.
That's
And the last
wild.
promotion I'll say, yeah, right. Such a something that at the moment I'm like, wow, rising stars. I'm a rising star. I don't know who any of these people are either. To look back on it now, you got Brian Pillman at WWE, former AEW, Jungle Boy, AEW, myself, NWA. So funny to see how that all worked out. And then I did travel in really the hills of West Virginia, as well as Kentucky and Tennessee, working in Moorhead, Kentucky for TCW, Thoroughbred Championship Wrestling. I was the first time that I won a heavyweight title was at TCW, actually. And that's also where one of my favorite matches of all time happened, but I'll save that for a later conversation. Shout out to David Tyler. He knows what I'm talking about. And then down in the hills of Hazard, Kentucky, Kingsport, Tennessee, West Virginia. I was wrestling for Appalachian Mountain Wrestling, and I wrestled for them for quite some time.
Is that Bo
And
James?
at a point, that was Bo James and Kyle Megard. That's correct. Yeah.
Very cool, and it's cool to see you starting to travel and branch out. And I'd imagine it's a good learning opportunity because, as much as you were learning in your local area, now you're dealing with completely new personalities, and I'm guessing you're mostly on your own. So you kind of have to be your own man at that point.
You sure do, and that's why it's so important to wait to branch out, right? You got to wait for those, for the tangibles, the athletics, the things that you can control, and the intangibles, right? The mindset, the personality, the behavior. You want to make sure that all of that's in line. You can't go into these promotions with a big head or too self-confident. You might be the best wrestler in the room, but if you keep your mouth shut and let your work do the talking, people will recognize that, right? And so that's what I think is the most important by waiting before going out.
Fast forwarding a little bit, you discussed the advice Karl Anderson gave you and the fact that you moved to California. Now, this was huge. We have Tyler Bateman on the channel already. We're just arranging a second interview. Great guy, great guest. He did something similar where he moved out to California and he basically had to start over. When you went out there, did you have any contacts in wrestling? Like you talked about Karl Anderson might have been able to give you a name or something. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so Karl Anderson introduced me to Dave Marquez and Jesse Hernandez at the Empire Wrestling Federation, EWF. And to tell you the truth, no one would touch me with a 10-foot pole. I
Really?
had zero luck getting booked at either Championship Wrestling from Hollywood or the Empire Wrestling Federation. Even though Chad had introduced me and I had wrote messages, had no luck. I started eventually showing up and doing ring crew for Championship Wrestling from Hollywood and the Empire Wrestling Federation, and still got nowhere for the longest time. It was actually 6 months that I spent living on couches, living in literal sheds, and eventually finding my home in Pomona, California, to really get booked. And that was thanks to Abyss. Abyss had flown out to California to wrestle for a Joe Khabib at PCW Ultra, and he had me come down and introduced me to Joe, and Joe was kind enough to put me on the card, and that was the first match that I had in 6 months. And it wasn't until I had that much or had that match that I started training at the EWF, just to get some ring time, and then the EWF started to utilize me after the PCW match. And then once I started to get utilized at EWF, then I had an opportunity by Andy Yuma, gave me an opportunity at the time at Championship Wrestling from Hollywood, and I must have impressed enough for him to bring me back. So that's kind of how I built that up. But it took some time. It was like starting from scratch, and it was one of the hardest things that I had to do to my ego, to my physical health, to my mental health, to all of those things. It was a trying time for me.
It's impressive that you did it. You mentioned Yuma. Shout out to him. He's a 3-time guest on the channel now. Total delight. When people are seeing this, I believe his 3rd interview is already out. If not in full, the clips are. So, guys, check that out. Make sure to show him support too. He's great. With championship
Yuma's
wrestling. Oh, sorry.
I just have to plug Yuma real quick since you're putting him over.
Please do.
Yuma's become one of my best friends in the business and out of the business. He's such a fantastic person. He's an inquisitive person. He's a really kind-hearted individual, and he's not afraid to tell you how he feels, and he's not afraid to hear how you feel either, even if it's the different side of the spectrum from where Andy is at. So I couldn't say enough great things about Andy. He's been a staple to Southern California wrestling and to Championship Wrestling from Hollywood for such a long time, and I owe it to him to have had the opportunity to get on Championship Wrestling from Hollywood, because without his support, I don't think I would have been there.
No, absolutely. And, there's 2 people I'll always praise endlessly for this channel. It's him and it's Sal Renaro. Sal was the very first guest. He's a 4-time guest now, which is crazy to even say. But, they're so kind. They've gone out of their way for me. And mind you, they didn't know me. I didn't have any connections before I started the channel in wrestling. I reached out to Sal. Sal and Wrath were the first 2 people. Adam Baum were the first 2 people I reached out to try to get in contact with. Sal was generous enough to go on the channel without knowing me, took a risk, and they've been so unbelievably kind, nice with their time. They'll put in the good word for me with other people when, again, they have no reason to. They're just that kind and that good of people. So I will sing their praises till the cows come home. So I'm glad to hear you say something good about Yuma too.
You said all the right things, man. Sal and Andy are just 2 delightful people, 2 cheerful people, 2 really good brothers, and that's hard to find.
Absolutely. So you talked about your slow progress to getting championship wrestling. In my eyes, it was pretty quick because I look at it like, of the, indies in California, there's two big ones at that point, PWG and Championship Wrestling. There's others that are various sizes, but those are, you got the TV with Championship Wrestling and you've got the buzz of PWG. So when you get into Championship Wrestling, what was your goal there? What were your plans there? Did you hope to rise up and become a regular? Did you hope to be a top guy in the company? Were you just hoping to learn?
Yeah, at that point, I think I was just grateful to have had an opportunity to show what I could do. And once I got in there and I got to work with some of the individuals, I quickly realized, just a few quantifiables. I thought, hey, I'm the tallest dude here, or one of the tallest dudes here. I'm one of the more bigger dudes here. I'm a good seller. I'm a good on the mic. I could really hone my craft at Championship Wrestling from Hollywood. It was never, for me, it's never a goal to be the top guy at a promotion. My goal is not to go into Hollywood, to go into the NWA or New Japan and be the heavyweight champion of the world, right? I'm there to be the best version of myself that I can be. And I saw Hollywood as that stepping stone to going from independent wrestling to television wrestling. So with those things, I felt that I had a pretty solid place on the card once I got my foot in the door. And really from there, I worked to try to understand the Southern California style, but also the television style. And that's where I really expanded my horizons and sitting in the production room and watching the executive producer Billy Trask cut television. I watched him cut television for 2 years. There wasn't every day I was at Hollywood, I was in the production room. If I wasn't wrestling, I was in the production room. If I was wrestling, I was in the production room right after. I was setting up the ring, I was tearing down the ring, I was helping with the cameras, helping with the lighting, doing all of those things that I mentioned to the younger guys to do because I wanted to just be an asset to the business. And that's where I really built lifelong connections that helped progress me to where I'm at today. And that's why it's so important, because there, all I wanted to do was learn. I wanted to learn, hone my craft, and be able to take that from Hollywood and put it on an even bigger stage. That's why I wasn't focused on becoming the champion, because yeah, the championship is great and all, but the real goal is to progress. The real goal is to continue to get bigger, more exposure, be able to influence more people. And that was my goal at Hollywood.
I'm so glad you brought that up. That's a theme that I've had on the channel before when talking about championship wrestling. Is a lot of people consider it like a stepping stone isn't necessarily the right word, but you talked about educational equivalence earlier, where your high school, your college. For a lot of people, championship wrestling was college for television because it's their first chance to really learn. Could you talk about first meeting David Marquez, and the experience you had with him, and your initial impressions, and how that changed over time, if it did?
Yeah, so I first met Dave. He's nothing but cordial to me. Dave invited me to his house. He showed me around his house. He had a room that was available for rent. I didn't have enough money at the time. I was living in my car, so I lived in my car for a couple months while I was out here as well, trying to find a place to live. It's quite expensive in Southern California, especially if you don't have a job and you don't have someone feeding you money. So I couldn't do that, but earlier on, I had a feeling like, man, maybe Dave doesn't like me. Maybe I'm just not his guy because I wasn't being utilized in any facet on any show. But then I came to realize over time that, Dave's expertise doesn't lie in booking the show. It lies in producing the show and being able to tell stories on camera. And Dave will give his input on what he sees that's good and bad. But I never thought, after I matured a little bit, I never thought that it was Dave doesn't like me. I felt like it was more of a Dave doesn't operate in that capacity. And the more that I got to know Dave, the more I came to realize that we have a fantastic relationship. And it's just a matter of me being able to make the things happen on the professional wrestling side of things, because Dave makes things happen on the business and the television side of things, right? And so I really grew into what I would consider a pretty solid relationship with Dave, and I hope that he feels the same way.
Very cool. And again, like I think about the influence he's had. I've had a lot of people on the channel talk about it where, you know, people don't have a lot of television experience before they get there oftentimes. I mean, sometimes you'll have a star come down to championship wrestling, but frequently it's the opposite, right? You'll take some guy from, Arizona or California or a neighboring state, and maybe they haven't necessarily cut that many promos, especially on television, because it's a whole different animal.
Yeah.
Can you talk about how it was to adjust from that? Because I don't know, even promos in general for you. I don't know how often you were cutting promos on the indies ahead of championship wrestling. So was it a culture shock for you to go from, the standard indies to championship wrestling, or was it a pretty easy adjustment?
It was a little bit of the same. You cut promos in the sense that very rarely, you might get a minute or 2 minutes on a show to say a thing or two in front of, 50 people or 100 people or 500 people if you're lucky enough and the crowd drew that well. But it's night and day. Independent wrestling is a totally separate category from television wrestling, because independent wrestling in my mind tends to focus on the professional wrestling aspect, right? You're there to watch the sport, you're there to be entertained, but it's not, when you go to television, it's not professional wrestling on television. It's television wrestling.
Mm-hmm.
You're not just taking a product and putting cameras and money and lighting behind it and saying, here you go, do what you do on the indies, but on television. It's totally opposite, apples and oranges. Television wrestling, you have to learn time cues, time signatures. You have to understand the structure of the show, the cameras to look at, when they're recording, when they're not recording, how to sell, where to sell, how to position yourself east to west of hard cam, or maybe north to south if you're running a specific spot. So those are just some very specific things that you have to take into account when you're doing television that's different. Luckily for me, I never found that I had too hard of a time talking on the microphone, so making that transition to Hollywood wasn't too terribly difficult. But I will say that the most recent year in 2023 and 2022 was some of my best work ever on television, and I owe that to the new head of creative, Daniel Hill, at the United Wrestling Network, because he gave me the platform to not just cut a 30-minute back or 30-second backstage promo, but to actually go out on the show multiple nights and to give me 5 minutes, 10 minutes, sometimes more time than people get to wrestle, to cut a promo. And that is some of my best experiences in professional wrestling, is talking in front of that crowd and having that microphone. I do not shy away from public speaking, brother. And you put a microphone in my hand and I can make you love me or I can make you hate me. That's my goal.
From a production standpoint, who was there early on guiding you when you were cutting promos? Because I'm across the world or across the country in the United States. I'm in the Northeast, right? So I've never been to a championship wrestling show. I don't know what the behind the scenes structure is like. I have a rough idea, but who was working with you when it comes to promos? Who was coaching you on what they wanted? Because obviously David does overall the production, but there's other people, the bookers and everybody else.
Yeah, it takes a village. There's a lot that goes into that, but as people have changed over time. Very earlier on, it was Andy Yuma. Yuma was guiding the program and kind of putting things where they needed to be. He was the head showrunner there and booker for the talent. So Yuma was providing me a lot of that initial advice along with Dave. Dave would watch the show and the programs and the promos and say, hey, try this or try this. And even still today, Dave does that for me. I mean, heck, I owe the golden truth hashtag to Dave. That was his recommendation, to start saying that's the golden truth. And I think that's such a good nugget, pun intended, such a good nugget to have as well. Another person that I'll credit in helping me develop both on the mic and in the ring is professional Peter Avalon. Pete and I spent a lot of time traveling the road to and from what used to be the United Wrestle Center, which was their training facility up north in Port Hueneme. And we would travel once a week there and sit in 4 hours of traffic round trip and just talk about wrestling, about promos, train in the ring. And so Peter was always there coaching me, and Peter was one of the first people that I had a professional match with on a bigger stage than Hollywood, which was our match for Impact Wrestling a few years ago. So I owe those guys. And then after Peter, I would say Aaron Stevens really took me from a level that was here and brought me through the roof. Aaron's knowledge base is what propelled my career, and I owe a lot of my developments in the ring, out of the ring, and on the microphone to Aaron. And then after Aaron, I would say Daniel has been such a great mentor too. Most people don't know that Daniel is an actor in Hollywood. He's several credited movies on Netflix, a few of which I've seen, a few more I've got on my list to see. But Daniel has a mind for the business that's different than anybody else's, because he has a master's in theater and he's taught classes and he's acted on that main stage and he's written professional wrestling. So for him to put emotion and meaning behind my words, not just what to say, but how to say it and how to convey those words and facial expressions on camera, that experience has been invaluable with Daniel at Championship Wrestling.
Thank you so much again for that insight. We're going to start wrapping up soon. You've been so generous with your time, and I appreciate it. I'm just going to ask a couple more things, and we'll get on out of here. Hopefully, we'll have you back for a part 2, because there's so much still to cover throughout your career.
I was going to say, I've got so much more experience to share. So if you want to make me into a Bateman or even a Yuma and Sal, let me know. I'll be happy to do a part 2, 3, 4.
I would love that. I would love that. In fact, I'm even hopefully scheduling a part 2, like I said, with Bateman. I'm hoping to get that all going. Royce Isaacs, I'm hoping to have a part 2 very soon. So I think, for one, I'm very lucky and fortunate to have guests who have a lot of fun stories to tell, and they're great at telling it, like yourself. And then I like to think we dive into subject matter that maybe a lot of interviews kind of skip over or skimp, and I like to get into the nitty-gritty. Maybe it's not interesting to everybody, but I love the finer details. I love to get into the weeds. So
Yeah, I hope you and everyone else that listens to this enjoys my gory stories. My uncle tells me I need to put it all in a book, and maybe one day I will. But to me, it doesn't seem that interesting. To me, it's just my life. But when I look back on it, I'm like, man, I've done a lot since since I was a child.
to me, though, that's the fun thing about pro wrestling is, like, when you're a pro wrestler, sometimes you can be like, oh, well, this is just a generic pro wrestling story. But there is no such thing as a generic pro wrestling story, because pro wrestling is so weird. And that's what I love about it. It's such a different thing than everything else in the world. And when you're a fan and you listen to these stories, like, it's insane. Wrestling is insane in the best way.
It is insane in the best way. You said it right.
Real quick, though, I do want to just talk about a couple of opponents. One you brought up already from your championship wrestling, from Hollywood career, and then later championship wrestling. First name that comes to mind, Zicky Dice, because at the point I feel like he was still, obviously he would go on to do NWA, he would go on to do Impact, and he's done a lot for himself. What was it like working with him at that point in your career?
It was a huge opportunity. Zicky had established himself outside of championship wrestling from Hollywood when we first crossed paths, and he was grateful enough to lay down for me. And that win in my career, again, wins and losses in the grand scheme of things, not like it means everything, but for me, it did a lot. You know what I mean? It established me as a main player at Hollywood. And I would say my feud with Zicky Dice, as well as my feud with Ray Rosas, those two things established me on the West Coast, and it established me for bigger storylines moving forward. Eventually, the Heritage Championship, and then the United Wrestling World Championship. And so Zicky was so giving in that time to be in the position that he was, to step down and really pull me up to his level. I can't say enough things about Zicky, man. He did a huge favor for me.
And the fun thing about pro wrestling, too, is, after all those years, here you are again in the NWA together all these years later. How cool is that?
It's so cool because we practically did the same thing, in a weird kind of a way. He was at Hollywood. He went to NWA. He became television champion. He went to Impact. I was at Hollywood. I went to NWA. I became television champion. I was on New Japan, so our careers, while they might not line up, are very similar in that fashion. And Zicky's such a good person to have in the locker room too. I love being around him.
The other person, you already brought him up, but I love hearing stories about him. I haven't had him on the channel. Someday I hope I'm lucky enough to. Pretty Peter Avalon. I think he's great. He's so charismatic. He's fun. You talk about, because you worked with him very early on in Championship Wrestling, but also, just him as a human being. Can you talk about him a little bit?
Gosh, I feel bad. You're right. Pretty Peter Avalon, not professional. Got to use the gimmick he's known for. He's always professional, Peter Avalon to me, but Pretty Peter Avalon. I can't say enough about Pete. Was like to put it in perspective, I was so lost when I came to California that the time that I spent with Pete, and he did not know this, and maybe I should have told him this at Andy's baby shower not too long ago. But sorry, Andy. Didn't mean to put your information on blast, but congratulations.
Yeah, congratulations.
Anyway, Peter was like a brother to me. Peter was one of those guys that was well established in the area, has been established for some time, and he really took me under his wing and showed me the ropes, but just treated me like a human being. He's such a great person, great outgoing, joyous person to be around. I would spend, a week with them in the Kokomos if we were just chilling on the beach drinking beers, or I would be more than happy to run a training with him or even wrestle him at any point in time, man. Can't say enough good things about Pete. He's done a lot for me, and he was the first person, along with Richie Slade, to make me feel welcome in the professional wrestling community in Southern California.
Very cool. Now, the last question I love to ask this to everybody, and if you're on multiple times, I'll probably ask you the same question multiple times because, in my opinion, it changes. What does the future look like for Jordan Clearwater?
Yeah, so the future is it's looking bright. I would say keep your eyes peeled for October 28th. I've been unveiling a new side to the Jordan Clearwater Golden Boy personality. Now that I'm aligned with the Overman EC3, the Golden Boy isn't just golden, but he is over because I am the Over Boy, Jordan Clearwater. So we're changing things, and I think that's got a great outlook. I did an interview with Sledge, and I remember when I sat on that Zoom call, I told him, I said, mark my words, this time next year I will be in the NWA, and I made that happen. So I'll say the same to you. I've got no doubt that I'll be in the NWA next year, but I will be a champion again because I'm confident in this direction that I'm moving, that I will be more than over with the NWA audience. And hey, I don't hate it being a good guy again. I love being a bad guy, but good guy Jordan Clearwater, well, he's much more fun.
Very cool. And, guys, when we do a part 2 in the future, we have so much more to discuss. We have more from your time in Championship Wrestling, the United Wrestling Network, the Primetime Live. We have the pandemic, which is something that is tough to talk about, but at the same time, I feel like not enough people talk about the impact it had on professional wrestling. It's fascinating. And, of course, so much of the National Wrestling Alliance being paired up with Tyrus and Idol and, Billy Corgan. Endless amount of stuff still to talk to, and I very much look forward to it. One more time, where can people check you out?
Thank you so much, Ken. You can check me at Clear Like Water, Facebook, Twitter /X, or whatever they're calling it now, Instagram and YouTube. Again, October 28th will be live pay-per-view out of Cleveland, Ohio, Salwin, NWA. And then if you want to watch me live or come see me live in Las Vegas, Nevada, you can see me close to the Strip. I am performing at the Steve Carr in a professional bodybuilding competition.
And once again, guys, we will have links to, all of his social media, to the NWA in the comments or in the section below. So be sure to check out the description for that. And guys, make sure to follow us too on Twitter at Armbars Sidebar, on Instagram at Armbars and Sidebars, and on YouTube at Armbars and Sidebars. Be sure to subscribe. We're slowly growing further and further. Leave some comments. I respond to everything. As long as it's nothing hateful or silly like that, I'll be happy to have a chat with you. Leave a comment. We have a good community growing, so thank you. But above all else, support the people who come on the show. Support Jordan. Follow him. Support his career. Sir, thank you so much. You were a delight, and I can't wait to chat again.
Hey, you and I both. I'm looking forward to the next one.
Until next time, guys. Later.